As it is, the war is escalating and spilling over. The attacks have intensified. Ukraine carried out drone attacks on Moscow. Russia sees this as provocation, its own attacks on Ukrainian cities notwithstanding. So Russia wants to retaliate. Meanwhile, Ukraine is pushing forth with its counteroffensive. They may or may not succeed, but they're going to need more weapons. That's certain. A seemingly uninterrupted supply of weapons, that's what Ukraine needs. Its key source are partners in Central Europe, but they've hit a roadblock. They don't have enough workers for their weapons factories. Here's a report.
Over 500 days into the conflict, Ukraine and its Western backers are confronting a new challenge. No, it's not the weapon supplies. Manufacturers are ready to meet Kyiv's requirements. What they are struggling with is talent. The workers needed to make the weapons are in short supply. A recruitment drive is underway in Central Europe. It's one of the key hubs where war supplies for Ukraine are built. Since the war began in 2022, factories in Poland and the Czech Republic have been churning out guns, shells and more. The output has already matched the size and scale of the Berlin War era. But the manufacturers think they can do better. They want to ramp up production, but they don't have enough workers. So the arms industry is rolling out lucrative incentives. A manufacturer in the Czech Republic has offered company-financed apartments for new hires and even free food in canteens. A Polish company has taken to social media. They are pushing ads on internet platforms to attract interest, but still, finding the right fit is a challenge. The reason is the tight labor market. Europe has one of the largest aging populations in the world. The weapons industry needs younger workers with technical skills. They are becoming harder to find. So, some manufacturers are turning towards alternatives. They are joining hands with local universities and exploring technologies like automation to expand. There is an urgency to ramp up production. The weapon suppliers are responding to demand. Central Europe is an important pipeline for Ukraine. Last year, 29 nations supplied major weapons to Kyiv. Out of the 29, 2 countries stood out: Poland and the Czech Republic. They sent more than 20% of Ukraine's arms needs. From tanks to armored vehicles, howitzers, air defense systems, helicopters, ammunition and rockets, Central Europe supplied all of this. And they intend to keep going, because the demand is showing no signs of slowing. Russia invaded Ukraine over a year back, and no side still has a decisive edge. The forces on both sides are fighting for every inch of territory, and they're leaving no stone unturned to gain the upper hand. Recently, Ukraine launched a counteroffensive. The goal was to push back the Russian forces and reclaim some of the lost territory. Progress has been slow, but Kyiv is pouring everything into the offensive, from heavy arms to even toy drones. Ukrainian forces have repurposed them for military use. On the front lines in Zaporizhia, a gamer-turned-soldier recently put a new gadget to the test. This drone might be small, but it packs a punch. It is flown straight into the target to inflict maximum damage.
Since I've been transferred to this unit to work with drones, every time I put on my goggles and take the joystick, I recall my mother telling me that those video games would not do me any good. Well, if this isn't useful, then what is?
The war in Ukraine is a frozen conflict, with no signs of simmering violence or bloodshed. So, as long as that's the case, the demand for weapons will thrive.
Things are escalating in Eastern Europe. Poland is making a big claim. They say their airspace was violated by Belarus. They say 2 attack helicopters crossed over on Tuesday. If true, this is a major escalation. You see, Poland is a member of the NATO alliance. Belarus is Putin's biggest ally. A clash between these 2 countries would be disastrous. So what exactly happened? The first reports emerged early on Tuesday. Polish residents near the border posted suspicious pictures. They claim to have seen choppers with Belarusian symbols. At first, Poland denied this. But around evening, Warsaw made a U-turn. The Defense Ministry admitted that there was indeed a violation. So what changed? Poland says the helicopters were flying low, so the radars found it hard to detect them. But Belarus has another theory. They claim that Poland made a U-turn after getting orders from the West. Basically, that Warsaw is lying. So which side do we believe? If Belarusian President Lukashenko did order this move, it is a brave one. Maybe borderline reckless. He has allowed Russia to use Belarus as a staging ground. He's also hosting Wagner fighters, but he has drawn one red line, and that's joining the war officially. That's something Belarus has not done yet. Belarusian soldiers are still inside their barracks. Would President Lukashenko risk changing that? And that too by attacking a NATO country? Imagine if this alleged helicopter adventure went wrong. Belarus would have been at war with NATO. So logically, it makes no sense whatsoever. Having said that, Poland did warn about this. Their prime minister said Wagner fighters could attack from Belarus. Lukashenko, of course, has denied this claim. He says there is no rogue Wagner movement.
I have to teach my units, because an army that does not fight is half an army. You also understand this very well. I don't want to go to war. I don't want our guys to die. Therefore, we need to teach them. So Wagner are transferring their experiences. They give advice and suggest some things.
Well, Lukashenko is not helping his case, and I'll tell you why. Last month, Putin was hosting Lukashenko in St. Petersburg in Russia. Midway through the talks, the Belarusian president decided to joke. He said Wagner fighters are eager to go on a trip to Warsaw. Maybe he thought it was funny, but when the punchline of your joke is all-out war, people may not find it funny. And Putin too made allegations against Poland. He said Warsaw wants to seize Ukrainian land. So put together, you have a very complicated equation. Poland, Belarus and Russia have never been friends. They have unfinished business from the Soviet times, and now there is a new variable in this equation, and that variable is called the Wagner fighters. Around 1,000 of them are based in Belarus. Poland believes they could be used to wage a proxy war. If that happens, what will NATO do? That is the big question. Technically, Wagner is independent from Russia. They're now anti-Putin, remember? So a Wagner attack, can it be seen as a Russian attack? Well, Washington says absolutely.
This group, at the behest of the Russian government, because they do not work independently of the Russian government, is a threat to all of us, and we have to ensure that the message is clear that any attacks by the Wagner group will be seen as an attack by the Russian government.
Now, a couple of things to note here. One, didn't the West cheer Wagner's mutiny? They billed it as some big defeat for Vladimir Putin. But now they're all making a U-turn. They say Wagner and Russia are the same. Second, the stakes are now much higher. Using Wagner was supposed to give Putin plausible deniability. He could have shifted the blame from himself, but Washington is on to him. They're saying Wagner or not, Moscow will take the blame if there is such an attack. So what is the next move? If Tuesday's incursion did happen, we should all be quite worried. Poland is moving around 1,000 soldiers to the border. They're preparing for the worst. And if Poland is attacked, NATO will have to join this war. It's a legal obligation. Remember the Article 5. If one member is attacked, all of them declare war. An attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. On the other side, Belarus too has a backup. Last month, Putin made a public promise to Lukashenko. He said an attack on Belarus would be an attack on Russia. So will things descend to that? Like I said, there is deep mistrust between Belarus and Poland, not just over Ukraine, but many issues. They also have guarantees from bigger powers, Poland from NATO, Belarus from Russia. So could they use this chance to settle personal scores? It's a dangerous prospect. Which is why we need calmer heads to prevail. And the last thing we need is irresponsible jokes and taunts. America has been downgraded. And that's our lead story tonight. The US, as you would know, dominates the global financial world. Financial managers want to invest in America. A US government bond is considered as safe as gold. And the dollar, for all the pushback it faces, remains the world's default currency. But America's dominant position is now under stress. A leading credit rating agency has downgraded the US. The name of the agency is Fitch. It assesses credit worthiness of countries, and it believes that the US is not as trustworthy as it used to be. So today they announced a downgrade, and the White House is pushing back. They've issued aggressive statements to counter the downgrade. This is, at best, damage control. We'll tell you why, but first the details of the downgrade. What does it even mean? What is a downgrade? Let me explain. Do you remember your grade card in school, your report card? It was an assessment of how you performed in different subjects. There were grades from A to F. A means you've aced it, F means you've failed. It's quite simple. And that's exactly how the Fitch rating works. It is a report card, but for governments. And what does it assess? Their financial health. Investors and lenders rely on these ratings. They use the rating to assess if they should buy a certain government bond. The rating helps them decide whether or not they should stay invested in a country. And this is the rating we're talking about tonight. Let's look at the Fitch report card. Earlier, America was rated AAA, AAA, the highest. The US was the school topper, the best in class, one of the safest places to keep your money. Now it has been pushed one level down from AAA to AA+. How bad is that? Well, technically speaking, not very bad, just a notch down in the pecking order. But along with the rating, Fitch has also shared an analysis, and it merits a closer look. Fitch says this downgrade does not happen overnight. America's position has been gradually deteriorating. And broadly, there are three problems: erosion of governance, rising government deficit, and high levels of debt. In fact, debt is what Fitch is the most worried about. America's national debt stands at more than $30 trillion. It is the highest in the world, $30 trillion. And the US struggles to manage it. And on that front, Fitch has issued a scathing indictment. In fact, let me quote from that report. In Fitch's view, there has been a steady deterioration in standards of governance over the last 20 years. The repeated debt limit, political standoffs, and last-minute resolutions have eroded confidence in fiscal management. There is a clear takeaway from this. Fitch has lost trust in America. It doesn't think that the US is the best anymore. And that's not sitting well with Washington. The Biden administration has come down hard on Fitch. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the Fitch downgrade is quote-unquote arbitrary, and that it's based on outdated data. That's the term she used. Yellen said she strongly disagrees with Fitch. And the White House has said the same thing. Larry Summers has also weighed in. Larry Summers served as the Treasury Secretary during the Clinton years, and he says the Fitch decision is quote-unquote bizarre and inept. Then we have statements from some leading economists. They've used words like strange and puzzled. But if you look closely, it is not strange at all. America owes more than $32 trillion. That is a real number. It's not an estimate. And every few years, this debt leads to a political standoff. You see, the US has something called the debt ceiling. That's a concept that they have. The government cannot borrow beyond a certain limit. So when it is about to run out of cash, it tries to raise the limit, or the debt ceiling, as they call it. Lawmakers from both sides have to come together then. They have to pass a bill. To keep the government running, they must pass this bill. And this often leads to an impasse. In some cases, even a total shutdown of government. Since the 1970s, there have been a total of 21 shutdowns, 21 government shutdowns in the US. This year, they almost defaulted on their debts, the US government. The Biden administration wanted to borrow money, but the Republicans were not on board. It went down to the wire. They waited till the very last minute to pass the new budget and raise the borrowing limit. So the US narrowly avoided a default. There was no shutdown, but the uncertainty spooked the financial world. This Fitch report conveys the same reality. So instead of complaining, perhaps the US should set its house in order. Now let's talk about another Southeast Asian country, Singapore, where the bottom line is, well, the bottom line. Back in 2007, the government made a major announcement. It had hiked the salaries of its ministers, not by 20 or 30%, but by 60%. An increment of anyone's dreams, really, 60% hike. The Prime Minister saw his pay jump to over $2 million. It was 5 times what then US President George Bush was making. Why was Singapore so generous with its ministers' salaries? Well, there is no hidden or evil reason here, hopefully. They simply wanted to pay the lawmakers well, to ensure that they were happy, to deter corruption, and to keep the politics clean. Today, Singaporean lawmakers are among the best paid in the world. Their salaries are comparable to top earners in the private sector. But here's the thing. When the government pays its leaders well, it also demands accountability. It always should, but in this case particularly. And a clear example of this is before our eyes. Meet S. Iswaran, the Transport Minister of Singapore. He was arrested last month in relation to a corruption investigation. Incidents of corruption are rare in Singapore, at least reportedly and until recently. Singaporean lawmakers are known to stand on high moral ground. And with Iswaran's corruption scandal too, the parliament refuses to lower its pedestal. An investigation is still underway, but Iswaran is already facing the music. His pay has been cut by 82%. You heard that right. A cabinet minister under investigation has got a pay cut, and that too by more than 80%, 80. It's almost unbelievable. How many times do you hear that? Not enough, I would say. Reports say this has happened only twice in the past, both times in Japan. In 2021, 5 officials in Japan's communication ministry received pay cuts. What for? For whining and dining. They enjoyed expensive meals sponsored by the companies they worked with. In 2018, Japan's then finance minister, Taro Aso, took a pay cut. It was voluntary. He let go of his salary for 1 year because 20 of his officials tampered with public documents. Can you believe it? The finance minister of a country taking 1 year's salary cut, taking responsibility for his team's actions. Sounds almost dystopian. That is not to say that ministers do not take pay cuts. Of course they do. All across the world on several occasions. I'll give you some examples. This year, Mozambique reduced the pay of its senior officials to reduce its salary bill. Last year, Malaysian ministers took a 20% pay cut. This was to show solidarity as their country suffered economic troubles. During the pandemic in 2020, both Indian and Kyiv ministers took a pay cut, which is all very well, but more often than not, these moves fail to impress people because leaders across the world have been involved in corruption charges. Take, for instance, Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan. He has more than 100 cases of corruption against him. Whatever the talk of political vendetta, there is proof of corruption against Imran Khan. He faces the law. Here in India, scores of leaders have corruption cases. What action do they face? How often is justice served? Forget punishment. Do they even get a pay cut? And that is not enough punishment for a corrupt lawmaker. But it makes a significant point. Lawmakers say they serve their country and their people. Do they face action when they don't do their job well? Do they get an incentive when they do it better? In a world where all of us are assessed on the basis of performance, I think it's time we demand better accountability and more transparency from lawmakers. Singapore's example is an interesting one. What do you think? Do you think salary cut should be punishment for a minister who doesn't deliver or is under investigation? Write to us with your thoughts. Our next story comes from China and Japan. 2 storms are wreaking havoc in these countries. Beijing is battling the fallout of Typhoon Doksuri, and Japan is facing off against Typhoon Hanoon. Beijing is partially submerged in water and mud. The Chinese capital has recorded its heaviest rains in 140 years. 140 years, which means it's the heaviest rainfall in Beijing since records began. Meanwhile, Japan's Okinawa island was battered by strong winds, heavy rain and destructive waves. More than a third of the island is without electricity, and it may take a while for things to improve. Here's more.
The rain seemed to have relented in Beijing, at least a little. That's because Typhoon Doksuri is moving on. But it left almost every part of Beijing submerged. These are visuals from one of the airports in the city. The runways were underwater and the flights were grounded. What you're looking at now is being called a graveyard of cars, all swept up and destroyed by the storm. Most of Beijing has been left with streets full of water, mud and trash. This is a wetland park in the city. The water levels have reached the treetops there, and the park has become home to a floating pile of garbage. Doksuri caused tremendous destruction. It will take a while to clean up. After being battered for 4 days and 4 nights, the Chinese capital seems to have gotten a break. But those 4 days took their toll. At least 11 people have died in Beijing, and some are still missing. Chinese paramilitary forces have been involved in the search and rescue. They've been taking out inflatable rafts to navigate through the roads that have turned into rivers, risking their lives to try and save Beijing's stranded residents. Reports say 2 of the 11 casualties in the city were rescue workers. They've also been delivering food and supplies via helicopter to residents trapped in their homes. The storm may be leaving Beijing, but it's heading further inland. Hundreds of thousands have been evacuated from cities in the neighboring Hebei province. That's where Typhoon Doksuri is headed. The typhoon broke numerous records in Beijing. The city saw its worst rainfall since records began 140 years ago. Since Saturday, it has received 744.8 millimeters of rainfall. It was worse than even the storm of 2012. That was when Beijing last saw similar amounts of rain. Just 40 hours after the rains began, Beijing received the average rainfall for the entire month of July. A month's worth of rainfall hit China's capital in less than 2 days, which explains why the city is in disarray. Now that the typhoon has gone, Beijing has some breathing space to work on rescue and recovery. But in nearby Japan, the chaos is just beginning. Typhoon Khanun is wreaking havoc there. Khanun means jackfruit in Thai, but the sweet-sounding name takes nothing away from its fury. It has just passed the island of Okinawa. Okinawa is located in the far south of Japan, and this is the state of the island. Cars have been tossed aside by Typhoon Khanun's strong winds. The winds uprooted trees in the island as well. They led to huge waves crashing down on Okinawa's shores. And the typhoon also led to a massive power outage. More than a third of the island's houses were without power. About 200,000 people were affected. All flights from the island's airport were suspended, leaving residents and visitors at the mercy of the typhoon. The typhoon is moving west towards China at the moment, but it is expected to return. Come Friday, Typhoon Khanun is expected to turn towards Okinawa again, and once again drench the island. So the island is bracing itself for a tough week. One thing is certain, none of this is normal. These extreme weather events are the result of human-induced climate change. We are making things worse. How long till we accept that our constant greenhouse gas emissions are harming us in the long run? How long before we work earnestly towards fixing our mess?
And finally, it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story, starting with Jerusalem. The August full moon, also called the supermoon, rose above the old city. It was the first of the 2 supermoons to be witnessed this month. In Sri Lanka, an uninvited guest appeared during a Lanka Premier League match. Players were as shocked as the spectators. We'll introduce you to the guest. Meanwhile, in China, the video of a bear is doing the rounds. It shows the bear standing on its hind legs inside a zoo enclosure. The video has sparked a debate. Is it really a bear or a man in a bear costume? That's the burning question in China right now. And finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1990, Iraq invaded its small but oil-rich neighbor Kuwait. It took only a few hours to capture Kuwait City. The Emir of Kuwait fled to Saudi Arabia. Iraq not only gained control of 20% of the world's oil reserves, but also a substantial coastline on the Persian Gulf. We're leaving you with that. Thank you for watching. We'll see you tomorrow from Gandhinagar.
I think we've got to wait for him to just exit. I don't know.
Looks a massive unknown. Who's the fourth umpire? He's a brave guy. Looks like it's. That must be a first. This type of a hold-up.
This is serious business here.
Nervous now. Which kid bag?